Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video of the most common 6.4 PowerStroke diesel engine problems. The 6.4 PowerStroke has maybe been a little overshadowed by its slightly poor reliability. When it comes to modding and tuning, the 6.4 PowerStroke is a great engine and a very desirable engine for modding and tuning. But just wanted to preface this video with that it is a great engine from that perspective. But again, it's been a little overshadowed and held back by its rather poor reliability, being one of the first PowerStroke diesel engines to use a number of emission systems. Jumping right into the most common problems with the 6.4 PowerStroke. Number one, we have radiator leaks. This is pretty straightforward, not really much to say when it comes to radiator leaks. If you notice a puddle of coolant underneath your 6.4 PowerStroke under your truck, then that's a dead giveaway that you have a coolant leak going on somewhere, and more often than not on the 6.4 PowerStroke, it is the radiator. So that tends to crack at the plastic end tanks where it meets the bulk or the core of the radiator. So that's really the main weakness. This part was updated by Ford, and the updated part does tend to hold up a little bit better. It still isn't totally flawless, and even the updated one does run into issues from time to time. But for the most part, a lot less common and a lot less severe than it was in the original or early days of the 6.4 liter diesel. Fortunately, compared to the older 6.0 PowerStroke, usually if you noticed a coolant leak on those engines, it was a head gasket problem, which is much more severe. So fortunately, at least on the 6.4 liter, it's just that radiator, which is a pretty simple repair there. Moving on to number two problem with the 6.4 PowerStroke is the DPF, or the diesel particulate filter, clogging. The 6.4 PowerStroke was the first PowerStroke engine to actually use DPF. The 6.0 did introduce a couple emission systems, but DPF was not one of them. So this was the first year for the Ford PowerStroke that they had decided to use the diesel particulate filter. And really just the biggest issue is that over time that gets clogged up with soot and particles. And once it gets clogged up, it can lead to a number of other performance and potential long-term issues. Obviously, as that starts to clog up, the DPF really creates a lot more back pressure, which is just unhealthy for the turbocharger, for the engine in general, and outside of that can reduce performance, reduce turbocharger performance, so on and so forth. The biggest downside of the DPF issue is that it can be a pretty pricey problem depending on what route you want to go. So you can pull the DPF off and sometimes successfully clean it, although a lot of the times that only ends up being a short-term solution, and you'll end up having to keep pulling that out and cleaning it very frequently to stop running into issues. Really the best solution for that is either, if you want to keep the truck emissions legal, you're going to have to get a new particulate filter, and those filters I believe run somewhere in the ballpark for a new one about $1,000 to $1,500. So a little bit pricey. And then of course the other option, a popular and common route, is deleting the DPF. That is not emissions legal, so we're not going to recommend that you do that, but that is a popular route and certainly a viable option if you do run into those DPF issues and just want to get rid of it and don't want to deal with more issues popping up in the future. Moving on to the third most common problem for the 6.4 PowerStroke is the EGR coolers. So the previous 6.0 PowerStroke did use an EGR cooler. That was just one single cooler, and that one was a little more problematic on the older 6-liter diesel. On the newer 6.4, Ford decided to switch to a EGR design that actually uses two EGR coolers. The main issue, first EGR cooler, the one that is subjected to exhaust gases first, that one tends to fail and get clogged up over time. A little bit less common than on the 6.0 PowerStroke, but still a frequent issue on the 6.4 diesel. Moving on to problem number four, we have the Siemens K16 injection pump. Now, this is actually a great injection pump from a flow perspective. Compared to the Bosch CP3 unit, the Siemens K16 actually flows a lot better. So if you're looking to mod and tune your truck, this Siemens K16 pump is going to hold up a lot better for that. However, compared to the Bosch CP3 pumps that were popular on diesels of the same era and even a little bit before, tend to be more reliable than the K16, and The Bosch CP3 pumps are also a lot cheaper, so the K16 on the 6.4 PowerStroke is very expensive. I think those run about $1,500 to $2,000 if you do run into issues with it. And really the biggest problem with that K16 pump is when it does actually fail, if you don't catch it soon enough, it tends to take out a lot of the fuel system with it, and so it'll take out those injectors, and those piezoelectric injectors are costly too. So if you do run into those K16 injection pump issues and don't catch things in time, it can do more damage and lead to very costly repair bills. We're talking $4,000 to $6,000. Can be a very serious issue. Not super common, definitely not one of the most common ones that we're talking about on this list. Just something to be aware of, because again, if you do run into that, it's very expensive, and obviously no one wants to end up with a $4,000 repair bill. So just be on the lookout for that K16 injection pump failure. Moving on to number 5, yet another issue with clogging, and this time it's the oil cooler that is subject to clogging. Sometimes this does get confused with the EGR coolers clogging. With the oil cooler clogging, this typically happens every 50 to 80,000 miles. The best bet is just going ahead and replacing that with a new oil cooler. Unfortunately, there haven't really been any solid updates from Ford for the OEM cooler, so typically the best route is, fortunately, the 6.4 PowerStroke is a little bit of an older diesel at this point, so there are known long-term solutions for this. So there are great aftermarket oil coolers that should mostly eliminate this issue moving forward. So if you do run into that, just look for an aftermarket option. That's usually the best bet to go ahead and get that fixed and also have that peace of mind for the longer term. Number 6, another problem with the 6.4 PowerStroke diesel is oil dilution, specifically fuel diluting the oil. This is due to the regen cycles. During the regen cycle, additional fuel is sprayed into the cylinders to try to clean out the DPF. And when that happens, the fuel tends to wipe off oil on the cylinder walls and mix with the oil, make it down in the crankcase. And so that's why a lot of the times on these 6.4 diesels, you can actually see them between oil changes. You might actually gain oil instead of having a little bit of natural oil loss. And you're not really gaining oil as much as you're just adding fuel into the oil. When you mix fuel in with oil, the oil loses a lot of that lubrication, which keeps the rods, rod bearings, all of those internal parts safe and healthy. When you have too much fuel diluting the oil, that's obviously not a good thing and can shorten and reduce the lifespan and longevity of the 6.4 diesel. The number one way just to work around this is sticking with more frequent oil changes. In the service manual, I believe they recommend an oil change every 10,000 miles. We would recommend cutting that in half, going down to about a 5,000 mile oil change interval. And another option is, if you want, you can go ahead when you do an oil change, do an oil sample or an oil analysis. You can send that into a company like Blackstone Laboratories. I think it's about $30 or $40 for the oil analysis. And they'll give you a full rundown, tell you if you should, give some recommendations as to whether you should change the oil sooner, whether you can make the oil last a little bit longer. So that's certainly an option if you just want a better idea of how much your truck and your 6.4 liter diesel specifically are actually diluting the oil. Moving on to number 7 here. This is a fairly simple issue, but yet another pretty common issue on the 6.4 PowerStroke, and that is cracked up pipe. So the up pipe is simply the pipe that connects the exhaust manifold to the turbocharger. Really, those just end up cracking. A couple symptoms of that: you might notice soot in the engine bay as those exhaust gases manage to escape. You can have a little bit of buildup and also hissing sound from the up pipe turbocharger area. So fairly minor issue in the grand scheme, just something to be on the lookout for on the 6.4 PowerStroke. Last but not least, problem number 8 that we're discussing here with the 6.4 PowerStroke is cracked pistons. This is probably one of the least common issues we're talking about in this video. Cracked pistons sometimes boil down to just high mileage engines, natural, random, one-off fluky failures, and then also occasionally on higher horsepower modded examples of the 6.4 PowerStroke. But it is something to be on the lookout for. Cracked pistons are something that we've seen on lower mileage examples, even stock ones that aren't modified at all. So a common option if you do run into cracked pistons, a lot of people upgrade to the Navistar Max Force 7 pistons, which were actually used on Navistar's 6.4 diesel, just the single turbo version built for heavier duty trucks. So that's a great option if you do run into cracked pistons, which hopefully that's not the case, since obviously that's a pretty severe and costly issue as well. Anyway, if you do run into that, check out those Navistar Max Force 7 pistons, as they tend to be a great long-term solution and reduce the chance of running into those cracked pistons again. So with that problem out of the way, that pretty much wraps up our common problems guide for the 6.4 PowerStroke. As a final summary here on reliability, the 6.4 PowerStroke certainly doesn't have the best reputation, and part of that is for good reason. It was one of the earlier trucks and engines with all of the emission systems, so there are some early kinks to work out with that. The engine was only around for 3 years, from model year 2008 to 2010, so that didn't really give Ford a lot of time before they built the new 6.7 PowerStroke to address any issues and mitigate long-term reliability concerns for the 6.4 PowerStroke. So Ford had just kind of moved on fairly quickly from the 6.4 PowerStroke. But again, as I briefly touched on at the start of the video, the 6.4 diesel is actually a great engine for tuning and modding. Very mod friendly. A couple simple bolt-ons can push nearly double the power and just shy of double the torque without really needing to do anything. So the 6.4 PowerStroke does have a very strong transmission. The internals outside of the cracked pistons and a couple other minor issues that can and do happen occasionally, but nothing to consider a common problem. Internally, a very stout engine, so there's a lot of potential with the 6.4 diesel. But again, moving through or looking at those 8 problems we discussed, there even could be a couple more that you could make arguments for, adding into the video and talking about a couple additional problems. Certainly a lot of things to look out for with the 6.4 PowerStroke, and if you're in the market for a used one, just check all of those aspects, look at previous maintenance records, see what has been done, see what hasn't been done. And of course, if anything looks off, have an inspection done, see if there are any issues or anything that might be popping up soon. That's all we have to say about the Ford 6.4 PowerStroke diesel. If you guys liked the video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check back for more content in the future. Thanks, guys.